Welcome to UberCube, the podcast where we discuss all things cube, but with refreshments. This is your host, Anthony Adams, and tonight I am joined by my other two hosts.
May, hello, it's me.
Hey, May, and it is Stu. How's it going?
It's going swell. How about you guys?
It's going all right.
It's a wonderful evening
Stu
night.
is our other very important co-host. We will acknowledge you as such. You are not just the tech guy, we promise.
Well, yeah, and I've had a bit of, some issues recently, like not feeling too good, like after CubeCon, and choosing to allow the position of co-host to be taken by those who are much more knowledgeable in their field than I might be, which is probably everybody. But, I'm still the tech guy, so I get to, come and hang out, which is nice.
So tonight we're choosing violence.
We are choosing violence.
Because we're going to talk about removal.
Destroy.
The framework, the idea, the conceptualization of removal, where it lies within different aspects of cube along the spectrum of removal, what qualifies, how to evaluate said removal in context to the environment so that it makes sense, and all the above.
That's right.
But before
It's a complicated topic.
It is
but
extremely complicated.
It's not complicated. Drinks.
Yep.
What are you having today, Anthony?
I am actually having something that I was a little on the fence with. It's an Ardbeg Wee Beastie. And here's why. It's an Irish single malt scotch. My problem with it is it said 5 years. I paid for not 5 years. So I was questioning and challenging. Our connoisseur, our good friend Kevin's going, no, dude, this stuff is dope. I'm like, dude, it says 5. Like, that's the same price I pay for something that says 15. It's like, he goes, no. This is high end. I'm like, it's 5. And he's like,
you should trust the man. He kind of knows what he's talking about.
He kind of knows what he's talking about.
Yeah,
and it is tasty. It's got a nice smoky texture. I kind of lean more towards the peats personally. It's got a nice like little. Smell. It smells like a little fireplace going on over here. It's pretty good. How about yourself, Stu?
I am fortunate enough that I have been gifted by my wonderful co-host Anthony the last bottle of the 2023 batch of Anthony's Magic. This was from CubeCon, right?
Yeah.
You took this to CubeCon and got to hand out a bunch of bottles to some unsuspecting and generally, I think the feedback was rock solid, right? People pretty much.
Yeah,
said that they really enjoyed
I gave it to John. He enjoyed it.
Yep.
John Terrell. Tappy Toe Claws actually was surprised by it.
Yep.
It was.
I think Slick.
Yeah,
good old Slick Jagger as well. He had a
good
bottle.
Stuff. Everybody got. I was just kind of give a little nip and passing it out. But yeah, it's something I enjoy. It's another craft that I enjoy. I need to make another batch.
You should.
How about yourself, May?
Yeah, what you got, May? What you got?
I am just enjoying some Kirkland wine.
Kirkland wine.
Just some classic cheap wine so that way I can be a snob. Anyways.
All right. Well, as I'm the only one that needs to crack it, I'm going to crack it. So today, we're going to dedicate this episode as well. So this is not just one that we've pulled from behind the couch. This is an episode that we're going to dedicate to one of our Patreons, our good friend of the show, Preston. So thank you very much for your continuing support, Preston. And this one's for you.
Yeah, and before we even get going, I've got a little story time to kind of give some, context to what we're going to be talking about today, an overarching idea. I was chatting today with our friend of our show from the Madison Cube group, Dan Lupe, and we were having this chat about this particular card, because I was kind of saying, giving a little bit inside information on what we're going to record this evening, right? Mm-hmm. And I said, well, one of the cards we're going to talk about is Curse of Swine. And I said it's X2 blue, sorcery, exile target creature. For each creature exiled this way, its controller creates a 2/2 green boar creature token. And he says, as he says, and there's no wrongness in this idea, that's not a good Magic card. And I said, I agree. But hear me out. And here's the context of the story. And as I explained it, he went, aha, okay, this makes sense. So our good friend Christian has the Bant's Enchantment Cube. It is a 180 cube. Oh. Now you see where I'm going with this. So it's a 180 cube. So the idea of it is obviously, as it says in the name, it's a focused environment on enchantments, but there's a plethora of auras in this cube.
Correct.
Right? And one of the things in an aura-based cube, or at least auras in general, that's always kind of wreaked havoc upon the idea of aura is the 2-for-1 concept, right? I Doomblade the creature, it takes out your, we'll say Rancor conversationally, I realize that bounces back to your hand, and whatever it was attached to. The two things are no longer on the battlefield. And that's always been a problem with auras. So how did Christian solve this without generating the field bads? He wanted to have a certain volume of removal spells, treating the cube. Let's give it even more context. The cube, the playstyle is kind of like Jenga or Topple. It's kind of stacking things, right? But he never wanted your entire stack to always get knocked over by every piece of removal within said cube. And how could you make it so the field bads on that transition didn't happen? May cast spell, intends to put it on creature. I sweep the legs from the chair underneath the creature. It doesn't resolve the enchantment sometimes, or May is now invested, let's say, 5, 6, 7, 8 mana to make this juggernaut of a creature with stacked auras on it, and I can remove it with a Doomblade effect.
Right.
His solution to this is I'm going to take away your juggernaut, but in exchange, I'm going to give you a 2/2 boar or swine, and I can get multiple. It creates this level of tension within that environment too. It's a really neat exchange. I'm going to kill the creature that I can't deal with that May has on the other side of the battlefield. I'm going to provide her a 2/2, but the payoff to do that, I'm now giving you something you can put more auras on. So it creates this battlefield tension while removing the field bats. And I think that, and after I explained this to our friend Dan Lupe, he's like, oh man, I love it when cards like this can find in an environment. Does that make sense to both of you?
Course.
Yeah, definitely.
It balances the equation of fun versus I have to deal with threats, and threats do exist. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I agree. It's a bad magic card. But I do agree that there's a reason for it to find a home if you are in an environment like that where low-costed removal in an environment like Christian's Bant Enchantment removal can be devastating. We actually drafted it yesterday, and I ended up on more than one occasion of I really don't have any other choice due to the fact that I've either mulliganed or, I've already had one of my creatures removed, that if I want any chance to try and put some pressure on my opponent, I've got to kind of go for broke and load up on this one creature with some enchantments. I did that. It still got removed. I got blown out, and now I'm sitting there with, very little on the battlefield. So this at least, Damnation is going to be probably a little bit too powerful, right? Just 4 mana, unconditional, destroy everything. Is that too much for a cube like that? Or Wrath of God or a Supreme Verdict, obviously in the colors? Then maybe. So I like the fact that it does give you something. So now you've got an opportunity to rebuild. If you do draw some enchantments, that now you've got a chance to put some pressure back on without just the, blanket, everything gets destroyed, see you later. But there's also the caveat to you're now only removing your opponent's creatures. So fills a different kind of gap, or fills a different kind of role, I think, than just an unconditional wipe the board. And like you said, I do like the tension that it creates. And sometimes those 2/2 creatures can be important for someone to be able to come back.
It introduces a whole level of dynamic gameplay. But on face value, taking that card out of that context, it's a fair assessment to say that's a bad Magic card. I personally don't believe it is. Like, I would run that in like some Commander game or something, but I'm playing that for a casual aspect, right? But if I were competitively presenting this to you, and I laid this out before you, and I said this is amazing removal, I would have a hard time winning that argument. But then when I give you the context of the environment, explaining what I did, and I'm not. It's separate. It's doing two different things. It's embracing the idea of the story versus looking at the back of the book to get that synopsis, right? Yeah. That's two different types of mindsets.
I agree. And it's not like, it is a bad card, but it's a bad card in the, do you want to pay 4 mana as an example, 3 mana to exile 1, 4 mana to exile 2, when you can pay 4 mana and destroy everything? Does that make it a bad card? Yeah, you could argue that it does, but it does, again, I think, find homes in environments where those 2/2s can be relevant, and the fact that you don't want something so powerful as a 4 mana board sweeper. And I will say categorically, I had creatures when we drafted the cube yesterday that were important. They weren't important because of anything individually that they did, any abilities, any of that. They were important to me because I just needed creatures on the battlefield.
Right.
So that would have been a nice little, like, okay, you've destroyed my, my better creature, but at least I've got something back so I can at least, start to get, gain some footing in the game.
Do you have any thoughts on that, May?
Oh yeah, I've actually had to go through a similar experience recently because I mentioned in our one of our previous episodes that I was trying to replace Crippling Fear, which is just another kind of board wipe of, hey, everything gets -3/-3 if it's not the chosen creature type. Well, it turns out that it led to a lot of field bads in my environment because a lot of the go wide decks didn't want to get 3-for-1, you know? But it's okay because Twitter ended up recommending me Harsh Mercy, which is 2 white, each player chooses creature type. Destroy all creatures that aren't of the type this way, they can't be regenerated. So now, even though it still does the board wipey thing that gets rid of like the party deck's main shtick of, I now have a party, I now gotta run you over. Now you have a way that you can actually deal with it without putting them so far behind that they feel out of the game.
Yeah, because I was out of the game.
But all three of those cards we named, though, the 2 that you just named, May, as well as the Curse of Swine, pulling those out of the context of the cube and presenting those to any player on the, I play Modern, I play whatever. These are amazing cards. I could see where that would be taken out of context rapidly.
Absolutely.
But when you understand the story elements of the environment, say in the Fey Cube or in the Bant's Enchantment Cube, then that idea sticks. It's on theme. Check with Curse of Swine. It doesn't create the feel bads where someone's overly invested. It doesn't discourage people from wanting to play your cube.
For committing to the board as
Yes.
well. And from committing to the board, which I think part of a cube like that, which is extremely creature-centric when it comes to the win condition, yeah, you do want people to be a little fearful. I will always say that, don't just dump your hand out if you're facing someone who could potentially have a Wrath effect in hand. I didn't do that yesterday to great effect, because if I did, it would have been even more of a blowout. But yeah, I like it. And I do like the word tension. I think the word tension suggests that there is some kind of decision-making process, not just on the turn or on the side of the caster. Like, yes, you're not just thinking, okay, I get to destroy everything. There's some other considerations there, which I think is nice.
So, Stu, would you mind taking us through a couple of these bullets we got here? There's some things that people need to ask questions of themselves about.
Well, because we've kind of focused on one aspect of removal, right? Which is creature removal. But this episode, we're going to expand it out a little bit more. So it's not just going to be a creature is on the battlefield, I'm going to cast a spell to remove it, or hopefully remove it. We can also talk about counter magic, right? I think there's a grand discussion. I think some people would argue that counter magic can be argued as removal. Some will argue that counter magic does not count as removal because you're not actually removing anything. You are countering something. Very fair point. But we'll get to all that, as well as the difference between spot hard removal and soft removal. So is it just I cast this spell and I either counter the spell that's on the stack or just destroy the creature, right? Or is it something that there's a condition involved, right? Maybe it's a power, or maybe it's a toughness, or maybe it's a CMC value. A lot of considerations there. And then disenchant effects, right? It's a removal. You're removing you're removing something. You're removing an artifact or an enchantment, as an example. Mass removal, right? That has to be part of that discussion, as we just mentioned with the previous card. Right. Things like Wrath of God. And then removal on a stick. I love that, on a stick. I've always loved that terminology, right? So something like Ravenous Chupacabra, where you get to play a creature, which now has board presence, which now allows you to apply pressure. But now you've got that ability to remove something, not necessarily a 2-for-1 because you've only got one creature, you've played a spell, but kind of is in a way, right? You've played one card, you've removed something, and you have a creature on the board. So
you win +1 in card advantage.
Yeah, you kind of have, right? So it is kind of it's a 1 for half.
And then, as we just talked about in terms of the story with the Bant's Enchantment Cube, Curse of Swine, there's environmental context.
Sure.
Where, like in the case of Uberbear's Artifact Cube, Disenchants carries a heavy weight of removal opposed to a traditional, like, Powered Vintage Cube, right? It transitions from, it has more viable targets, which we're going to lead into. May, would you mind taking over the 3 core elements, please?
Absolutely. So, when you're considering your importance of removal, the core elements of it is how much density of the targets that you have, what is the power of your removal, and how much versatility that removal has, right? So we'll start off by saying density, creature ratio, etc., because this is the thing that I've debated with you, Anthony, a lot about, where Lightning Bolt does not belong in every cube. If I put Lightning Bolt in the Fey Cube, it would be answering 80% of my targets, which is a higher percentage than a lot of my other removal options at 1 mana. And there is at no point when I'm looking at a Lightning Bolt in this context of the Fey Cube and thinking, oh yes, this is a fair card. It is. Lightning Bolt's a powerful card. In a lot of environments, it's a little bit closer to like 60%, maybe closer to 70%. But for the most part, when you are looking at your removal, you have to ask yourself, well, how many things is my shock hitting? Is it like 70-something%, which is probably good for my environment? Or, say, eliminate, where it's just destroy target creature that costs 3 or less. How many of those creatures are 3 or less? Does it have enough valid targets to justify its inclusion in your environment? Then you move on to the second bullet point, which is power, which has to do with, I would say, the efficiency of the card. For example, Dismember is one of the most famous forms of removal in a lot of formats because it's effectively colorless, 1 mana, target creature gets -5/-5 for a lot of decks. And that's huge. That is a powerful removal spell. And -5/-5 is going to destroy like most things. And it gets past indestructible. There's a lot of advantages to it. Versus, a Doomblade. How many non-black creatures are there? Sure, it's strong. In a lot of environments, it's going to be strong, but it's a different power from Dismember, is my point there. Then lastly, what the versatility is, how many valid targets do you have? Not just creatures, but also can you do things like Vindicate, where Vindicate is just 3 mana, answer everything.
Or you can make it more narrow with like a Braid, where it gets an artifact, or it does 3 to a creature type situation, but it has modality. And then it kind of forks into 2 different subsections of the removal aspect at that point. And that's where that contextual idea pulls into it. Uberbear's Artifact Cube plays into that idea where a card like that suddenly creeps up on the power level spectrum because the opportunity for it to hit more targets have now spread wider. I can get a vast majority of artifacts, which is over 50% of the cube. So it has a 50% kill ratio on that one. And then when I weigh in my 3 or less power toughness on my creature spectrum that are even outside of the box of the artifact creature type, then the spectrum even increases, sometimes pushing it to 70, 80, 85%, which leads me to kind of a curveball that I want to throw at May. What is your litmus test percentage in your mind that a card needs to hit to be viable? We'll just say the Fey Cube. Like, what is your benchmark 60%. Where it needs to exceed this ratio before I will allow it to enter my environment?
I tend to stick with 60% in the Fey Cube.
I do as well.
The reason why is that I want removal to be consistent a little more than half the time, but I'm wanting my creatures to feel impactful later. And that is the discussion we're going to have here in a bit. But the amount of reasonable targets needs to be viable. So even though, let's take Portable Hole as an example, right? It has a lower percentage, but the things that it is targeting and it's able to deal with is going to be your 1 and 2 drops just to keep pressure off of you so that we can get to those later cards. So Portable Hole in the Fey Cube is perfect addition, even though it's included in other more powerful environments too, because it scales for what type of threats are hitting the board.
But then also cards like that, where they become, and I quantify that as soft removal in my mind because it's conditional, but also has it also has a shelf life on it. Eventually, you supersede that targetable range, right? The threats scale with the mana curve, so then Portable Hole starts to lose its value in the late game. But early game, it's detrimental, as you said, to holding off the build up to the armies. But once they surpass that and transition to mid range and so on and so forth, cards like that suddenly start becoming the fodder for your discard outlets example, right? That we talked about in our Art of the Discard episode, where
it increases storm count.
Right. Storm card, whatever you got to do, right? You start finding some other thing to do with this because it becomes dead in hand, which is fine. Or you can do the thing where we just hold it up and keep it in our hand, and I pretend like I've got something to do, but I've got nothing at all. But
I mean, that's just the nature of removal cards in general, is that if you don't have a target on board, it's going to sit in hand. That's just the nature of it.
Yeah.
And in the case of my 60%, 40% of the time, there's probably not a target that you can hit on the board. And, that's not even taking into account the proper curve of gameplay and whatever that we don't need to crack all the way into, because it's just a lot to take in. But when it comes to the context of where that removal piece is important, portable hole into some O-ring variant is a reasonable transition for the fake cube.
I would agree with
for
that.
soft removal into later soft removal that hits more targets.
Yeah, so the shelf life extends. So I have a hot take statement, and I wanted both of your thoughts on this one. And I was going to make the argument or the point that much like land type decisions, your removal speed and diversity impacts the tempo of the game and the gameplay drastically. And what I mean by
take.
I don't know how much a hot take that is. That's probably pretty...
I'm okay with that response. I think it's
glass of ice cold water.
a glass of ice cold water slightly boiling over. We're gonna dry ice. But what I mean by that is, if I have a mana base that's consisted of tap lands, it obviously controls the speed at which you cast your spells.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
I would say that your density and the diversity of your removal types has to be managed or mitigated in such a way that it doesn't, on the other spectrum, destroy your spells, right? Remove them from the context of the game. So that, and we've said this before, armies must march, games have to end, and players don't want to play games where every time something sticks, it gets removed. That's not volleying. There's no, in my mind, there's not a great deal of strategy behind that idea, where Stu has spent all this time casting something for 7, and I can kill it for 1
or
2 repeatedly, over and over. And there's no point in him even bothering with that strategy. That happens oftentimes in a lot of environments where someone will try a far-reaching strategy, or you're trying to test something that's a little outside the box, and the difficulty level is so high and it's so fragile, so glass cannon, that oftentimes your player will give up on not try that again.
I like that you mention the efficiency, which obviously you're discussing, right? The efficiency of the removal. That has annihilated me on more than one occasion where I've drafted and I'm like, right, this is cool. I've got a decent curve. I've got some creatures at the top end that I'm planning to use as my game enders. And I'm spending, exactly like you mentioned, I'm spending 6 mana, I'm spending 7 mana, and then I'm just watching my opponent 1 or 2 mana. 2 mana typically. 1 mana's, I think, is maybe a little bit reserved for the vintage power level, right? But even at 2 and 3 mana, you're right, it does feel incredibly unfair when you think, all right, I'm putting all this resource and all this time, right, a full turn's worth of my mana to be able to try and get this creature into play that I want to be able to stick, and then it's like, and it's not just 2 mana removal. It's 2 mana counter your spell, 2 mana destroy your creature. And that has been problematic for me on more than one occasion. And to be fair, when you look at we're talking about density of the removal, but then look at the density of each of those different types of removal, right? Look at the density of the counter magic, of the hard removal, of the soft removal. And I can certainly state that I've played against decks that have just gone real hard on the drafting phase of going for those effects, right? Going for the hard counters, even going for the soft counters, like a mana leak, which is conditional, but 3 mana on top of your spell means that if you're trying to cast a 6 or a 7 drop, are you having 10 mana out at the time and you can afford to pay for mana leak? Probably not. Again, I got screwed by that yesterday with a 6 mana spell. So, the density of those really low conditional not removal spells or counter spells, they can be incredibly problematic from a player enjoyment perspective.
May has a thought.
Yeah, I just wanted to piggyback off of that and mention that one of the things that's important to mention is that it also directly affects your quality of upper mana cost creatures. Because now all of a sudden your 6 drops have to have that, this card can't be countered, or this card has indestructible. You have to start tacking on all this extra stuff, or it needs to come in and do something in order to not just die to some Vindicate. Because what happens is that people do play the more efficient spells, and what happens is that you play a lot for those, and then you end up with nothing. So when you are crafting your environment, especially in low power, the stronger your removal options are, the weaker your top end section is going to be by proxy, And that means that they usually have to be more as powerful or more powerful than whatever the removal option is, if that makes sense.
Yeah, especially if it's not conditional, right? If you can just remove any 6 or 7 drop and you've got a suite of removal spells that allow you to do that with no penalty, then yeah, absolutely.
That's where the
I
Baneslayer...
have a very specific example. So, in a lot of low-powered environments, shock is king. So things like disfigure, shock, whatever. It's things that are toughness 2 or less. It does thing. So once you have a bunch of 4-drops that have 2 or less toughness that don't do anything, they become irrelevant. However, in the case of my Fate Cube, I very intentionally added a card like Marsh Flitter. So when this card enters, it makes 2 more 1/1 Goblin Rogue creature tokens. But you can also sacrifice them to give it +3, turn it into a 3/3. So what happens is that if you force somebody to try to remove the Marsh Flitter or the tokens or whatever, then you can just sacrifice one of the tokens to protect it. Or if they have something to go over it, you can just let it die and keep your tokens. No matter what the exchange is, you're going to feel like you had some impact on the board, even though it was just a 4-mana 1/1 flyer that made 2 more 1/1s. And things like that is crucial for a lot of low-power environments, and it's true for high-power environments. So it's just something to keep in mind as a curator.
So this kind of goes into that idea where your removal needs to match your mana curve, or at least your, I guess, where you're going to max out. Use an example from our good friend of the show, Andy Mangold, who has the Bun Magic Cube. He has intentionally pulled his mana curve closer to the base so that I guess, more fast and furious, quick turns, right? But he's talked about numerous occasions with Anthony, and they've discussed how, like, a card like Disfigure has much further reach because the mana curve has come lower on spectrum, so that you're not really getting into this, 5/5 dragons. You're pulling back, so it has a much larger density of viable targets that it can kill, increasing the value of worth of a card like Disfigure that, again, on paper, served on a platter with no context.
Doesn't look great, does it?
But then,
put it in some context
to that environment,
exactly.
It's now hyper powerful, right? Because it can get around a lot of those qualifiers that May was talking about. If it's a 2/2 creature that has indestructible, this -2/-2s and deals with that threat, making that more interesting. Even cards like Eliminate and all those type cards, or they have more reach now because the context of the environment provides the reach of the removal. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
So, but taking these cards in a vacuum is my point. Taking them out of that spectrum, taking just what you know about Curse of Swine, and I represent that to you. Is that a good Magic card? A lot of people would say no. If I said, Stu, I want to put this inside of my Powered Vintage environment, I imagine you would have a lot of feelings about that.
Yeah, I would probably say it's not good enough.
But then when I pitch it to you that Christian runs it within his Bant enchantments, and here is the logic for it, then it's not in a vacuum anymore. You would understand the argument. Now, translating that argument to other players is very difficult. I get that. People from outside the meta may not see that range, but that range serves a purpose for the fun factor, for the depth of the cube. And then, as we talked about, when you kill that giant topple creature and you knock it over, you are giving your opponent that the Rancor fell off, right? Well, yes, they can now put the Rancor on the 2/2 swine, representing a 5/3 trample swine. Did I get that right?
It was a 3/3, was it?
It was a 2/2 that it made
2/2
so
it gives it +2/+0.
+2/+0, yes. But you understand what I mean. So
exactly.
It makes it into a 4/2.
Makes it into a 4/2. That's a threat.
But it creates this game tension without taking away from the game outside of the arena of the game.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's a good talking point. Now let's talk about, this is going to be a best laid plans. There's no science to this. It's the architecture of this idea, right? A lot of this is going to be ratios within ratios and percentages. And it's almost like a framework. That's what we're talking about here. There's no blueprint that we're going to get right. There's just starting points, benchmarks that we can try to give in. So one of the personal things I do is I try to make my removal 2 to 3 less than the threats, like based on the threat density. So if I had a Dragon's deck and everything was 5/5s, I would want my removals to be 3s. Does that make sense? Stepping 2 back.
Yep.
And that's like fair play. But I don't want to build an environment where all my threats are 5/5s and
then
cost
all the
5
removals are
ones,
5.
ones and 2s.
Yeah,
Because
or a
it
fraction of
changes
the
the whole
cost.
pacing of the game so that players don't want to play your environment every time they try to cast a Shivan Dragon and you have to exile it.
Yeah.
And then you see what I'm saying? If that's repeatable over and over again, the fun factor is going to be diminished and they may not sit at your table again. So I think that loosey-goosey 3 to 5 mana value less than the threat density, right? As long as that where the haymakers land, the things where people are going to invest the most to get the thing, I think your removal should be somewhere in that suite. Do you agree with that idea from a framework idea, May?
Yeah, I think that is a pretty fair approach to it. The approach that I took is that I am asking, like we mentioned earlier, at what point is this removal going to be the most impactful? What's the ceiling of my removal in this environment? So, say I managed to play one of the O-Ring variants, right? But I'm still having to pay like 3-4 mana just to get rid of your 6-7 drop. Then at that point, I'm still in a position where I've spent less than you, but it's not as backbreaking.
Yeah, it's not as egregious.
I think that is a good point. But it also just depends on what your goal is for the environment, because how much density you have.
I tend to lean to the less than aspect.
I don't want
I don't want the dragons to be killed by
a 1 mana.
But I also don't want them killed by a 7 mana kill spell. I don't want the kill magic, the removal aspects to outweigh the cost of the threat density.
Sure.
So I typically want to lean towards the less than spectrum. Does that make sense?
Of course. So you don't want your removal player, right? Whoever's drafted removal.deck or counter.deck to be able to say, I'm going to remove your 7 drop with 2 mana and then spend that 4 or 5 mana if, based on parity of mana, for an example, to be able to say, I can just destroy your thing for 2, and then I can play my 5 drop, which is not far off as impactful as your 6 or 7 drop, and I'm probably going to win the game. We've invested the same amount of resources, but I've stuck a threat, and I've removed yours that you've expended all these resources into, and that's just going to, again, like you say, the person who's invested all that, and a card, and all the mana, and whole turn, they're not going to feel very good about it.
May, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I do agree that it just tends to lead to a lot of feel bads on the account of the player playing the big spell. And I think Stu did a really good job articulating that. And the thing that I would also like to add is that when your removal is efficient, you can consider, either in the case of the Curse of Swines, where you're giving your opponent something, or just soft removal of, I'm removing something for now, until you have a way to answer it. And sometimes that's just fine. I chose my O-Ring examples very explicitly, of saying, okay, I O-Ringed your thing. Do you have something to answer my O-Ring to get back your threat? So,
which kind of ties in that architecture before we branch off. So we kind of got like a mana value blueprint. There's no science to this again. This is just more of the thumb in the wind of what we've experienced from curating cubes for a long period of time. But another thing that we talk about in that idea when she's mentioning like an O-ring versus like a Path to Exile is the speed.
Right.
The tempos of the games are also directly impacted by that diversity, which leads to that framework idea. Within that mesh of that framework, so if I do 10% of my cube is going to be removal, my designation of removal. If I just say that's where I want to start, I'm building my first cube, I'm frameworking right now, and I'm going to do 90% creatures. Let's don't even do that. Let's do 50% creatures. Let's do 50% utility things. It could be enchantments and whatever, ors, I don't care. But then I'm going to reserve a certain fraction of the 100%, which I know my math is bad, for removal density. Just bear with me here. We'll say 90%, I've left 10% available.
Sure.
Within that subset of that 10% that I've now allocated for some form of removal, I'm now going to be allocating it to those different sub-branches of removal, going back to the mass, spot, soft, counter magic, disenchant, utility type equipment, and removal on a stick. Within that subset of that 10%, because I'm counting those and then figuring out the ratios as to what the targetable accountability is of each card. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. You're basically doing like, it's like a schematic is the best way I can explain this. You're laying it out, and I'm doing 90% is going to be spells that do things, that my theme, whatever, right? But 10% allocation is going to be this. Then I'm subsetting within that. Well, I want, like, for example, to make this real, in my 360 environments, I typically do 3 to 4 mass removals, and I try to spread those the best I can across the power and across the color band, right? So if I had, we'll just say something typical, a Day of Judgment and a Wrath of God, those would be my 2 allocations within that white slot. Then I'll go to my next black slot and I'll say, well, I want a Damnation and I want, I don't care, a Grooks, whatever. Doesn't matter. We'll just throw something in there. But then I have to kind of culminate that and see if it fits within those ratios. And one thing we kind of jumped over to, Planeswalkers, in the case of like David McDarby's Live the Dream Cube, they fill the role of the removal suite in that environment, changing the context of how you would view a Planeswalker typically, because he's looking for stuff like Garruk that has a fight ability or whatever, right? Or Nahiri that removes something tapped, or you get the point. That it is now been reallocated to a removal portion of that subset of removal when you're looking at the grand scheme of your cube. It's the best way that I was going to suggest, and it was going to be in my closing notes, is sometimes it's okay to put this like in Excel and convert it to a pie chart so you can have a visualization of where you land on the removal versus threat type of aspects and what type of allocations you provide. Or you can use Cube Cobra and label them and put ideas behind it. Like, I'm going to call this soft removal and I'm going to call this, and then you can run your tables and see where you land on those benchmarks and use that as a framework. May, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yes. When you're looking at this framework, okay, great. You now have the information in front of you. You now know how many mass removal things you have, how many counter spells, how many things that answer artifacts and shamans, how many creature removal, etc. Let's loop all the forms of removal all together and then separate mass removal, right? So in this case, what does this mean for your environment? So if you have, say, more than 4 different sweepers, then your boards aren't going to get very wide. And when you keep that in mind, you shouldn't be trapping players into investing a lot of mana into playing these really wide decks, which was a criticism that I got during CubeCon, was that a lot of those go wide decks kind of suffered the second a sweeper came out, because, and thankfully in my environment it wasn't too bad, but when it comes down to it, when you're in the same way that you were spending 1 mana to answer some 5 mana threat, it's in the same way that you're spending like 4 mana for Damnation, right? To destroy 3-4 creatures while you lose maybe 1.
And it's 1 card to get rid of 3 or 4 cards. Like, sometimes we've talked a lot about the mana investment, but sometimes it is a card resource investment as well, right? Because we looked at the card that you mentioned, right? Your story card there. At least you're getting a couple of tokens. So even though you might be exiling 2 or 3 or even 2 creatures, they're getting 2 creatures back, even if they're just little 2/2 tokens. But if you're just wiping the board with a Wrath effect and they're losing 3 cards for your 1, even if you're losing 1 creature that's not impactful and you're playing around it, then I think you're kind of sending that same kind of message by including those cards, that those strategies are I don't want to say that they're invalidated, but you're going to struggle in the presence of a lot of wide removal.
I would agree with that. So using those proportions and ratios is a good benchmark, right? And I would say feel free to look at my cube environments and May's cube environments. You can find me at UberBear on Cube Cobra. You can find May as well. I'll include these in the show notes, and our good friend Chris, and in this case, the Bant Enchantments cube. And you can see these ratios and how we've mitigated a lot of these problems. And it's a very fine-tuning thing. So when I say 10% is a base number, I mean, it's plus or minus 5%, right? It's throwing the proverbial hand grenade, right? But until you get it right, it's tuning. And another thing with calibrating, the calibrations of certain types of cubes is a little cleaner. Like, for example, in a peasant and pauper environment, specifically even pauper, by what people know about them, they tend to be creature rich, creature dense. So increasing the volume cranking it up towards 20% removal makes more sense in that environment.
I was going to mention that point, right? So you're talking about 10% being a ratio, but what does that cover when you're talking about the ratio of just creatures that are in the cube as well, right? So 10% with what ratio of creatures are in the cube? Does that mean that the cube is 50% creatures and you would suggest 10%? Is it 60%? Is it 70%? Is it 30%? Because obviously that's important as well, right? It's not just the number of, or the percentage of removals in there. It's what is it removing, which is going all the way back to the origins of the conversation, right? The start of the episode. What are you being able to remove with that? And if you've got a ton of good removal, but there's not too many impactful creatures within the cube, then obviously their value is not going to be as high.
And that's where those tables from like Cube Cobra are just totally invaluable.
I like Excel, but we're going to use
Excel.
as well.
Excel works too, right? Whatever method
like
you want to do to quantitate the volume of the different, you don't have to overthink it. You can just do categorization, for that matter, using Cube Cobra, which I love. You can do the markers, like I said before, and go, this is an artifact qualifier. This is also an enchantment qualifier. I'm going to give it the color purple to designate that this type of removal will hit that point. So you can look at it from 40,000 feet. Because this is one of those things like, you know how people you see a lot of times in movies or a mystery case where they lay all the pictures out on the floor to solve the mystery. This is one of those things sometimes you as the curator have to step back and look at it from the highest level and bare bones this stuff. Like, what am I looking at? These are my targets. What is it going to hit? What is the ratios within my 360, my 540, or whatever variance you have of that number? What is it going to entail? May?
So when it comes to taking all this information, trying to get all of your data, figuring out the percentage of your cube, well, let's say you as a listener, you're hearing that and you're overwhelmed. This is already just a lot of information coming at you and you're like, that's a lot of work. Something that's easy for you to consider that you can take at any degree for just starting your cubes or just kind of looking at the cube that you have is look at your current removal options and then ask yourself with each removal piece, what is this answering? What is this? When is this answering the thing? And what is the purpose that I'm trying to do with those things I'm answering? So when you have a high percentage of removal, obviously that also means that there are just going to be less creatures on board. So when you start at 10%, it's going to be a little bit easier to determine that some of the creatures will stick. Maybe I would say 5, maybe 4 to 1 removal when it comes to creatures played in the game versus creatures removed, right?
Yep.
In a direct sense. But when you are looking at your removal pieces, you are trying to ask yourself, what deck are you hurting and what deck are you helping when you are throwing those in? And it is a much faster and easier way if you're getting a little overwhelmed with the percentages and stuff, is just go through each of your removal pieces, just take your box of cards, look at your removal lines, and just ask yourself those questions.
Let's do something a little bit more real world. I thought of this as you were speaking. Let's pretend I built a cube and my design goal is that the cards were going to have haste. The creatures were going to enter the battlefield. It was going to be a fast and furious type of playstyle. Everything comes in has some form of haste. Everybody gets an emblem that creatures have haste. I don't care. Everything's going to be fast.
You get a concordant crossroads.
Yes,
you get a
everybody gets one.
Everybody gets a
so
crossroads.
now you can see where instant speed removal would be the higher density in that idea, regardless of the math and all we're doing, versus sorcery speed is you've already gotten hit by the creature and now you remove it after the fact.
That depends on your design. Like, do you want people to just be getting smacked by creatures for a faster,
yes,
lightning round
but I wanted to give something
like
that was a little bit more like thought-provoking. Or what if my design goal was creatures that have vigilance? You've now officially turned off every card in Magic that says tapped, unless you're doing something to force it.
Sure.
So now that whole suite of removal spells that's looking for something to be tapped, you've now turned off that conditional aspect of that card. Mm-hmm. So now you've taken away that diversity. That pull has been removed from you as the curator. Those are really weird outliers, but if people are getting more into the far-reaching, interesting design aspects, these are the qualifiers, right? When you're looking at stuff is how fast do I want it to be? How much do I want it to be? What are my targets? What are my ratios of targets within ratios, subsets? And how much versatility do you want out of it? And then, as we referred to in our modality episode, players like choices. and we're going to talk about some of that, sometimes people are willing to sacrifice raw power just for choices. We'll move on to that. Well, just think on that for a moment.
I would agree.
Yeah.
All right. Do you want to start out with our first colour of the evening?
Yes.
All right. Here's our first colour of the evening, and we're going to start out with white. I like that we're starting out with white because it's got probably the de facto best single removal in the game, would you argue?
I would agree, yeah.
All right. Swords to Plowshares. 1 white, exile target creature. Its controller gains life equal to its power. I like the line that you've put in here, right? So I'm going to read this off. This is in Anthony's show notes, which will be available. Is the trade-off for life worth the removal of a game-ending threat? This is a interesting way to look at it, right? And I think typically most players would argue that, yes, I am very, very happy for my opponent to gain life if it means that I'm getting rid of their threat. And I think it also, a lot of it depends on how do your players view their life in the cube, right? And the reason why I say that is, for example, the cubes that we played last night, right? Mm-hmm. We all hung out on a fine Thursday and did some cube drafting. We drafted Sandwich's Peasant Cube, and we also drafted Christian's Bant Enchantment Cube. Life has a very different meaning when you are looking at the cube that you're drafting, right? So when I'm drafting those cubes, life is a resource that I am using to not lose. When I'm playing a vintage cube, life is a resource that I'm using to win.
I would agree with that. That's not a. I don't think that's an overly bold statement.
I think it's a very
it's even
basic
more interesting.
Statement.
Like even in the, as we're going to talk about in the peasant episode,
Mm-hmm.
aristocrats is sapping your life, so that trade off of life is more invaluable than you would think. It's not something you want to do, and sometimes you, like in an Orzhov aristocrats package, you may want to run a Swords to Plowshares because it does qualify. Mm-hmm. But do you? Because you're trying to drain them incrementally, this card suddenly creates a new tension in that context of that environment versus a powered vintage cube. You're like, what else?
Are you trying to say that Swords to Plowshares is scalable like Force of Will?
No, I would not go that far. Because there's other.
You sounded like you were trying to make an argument there about it just a second.
Because there's secondary components to that.
Sure.
You could do the life is an aspect of that decision. But then now you're throwing in the total efficiency of this card, right? It only takes 1 planes.
It's absurdly efficient.
Right, it's absurdly efficient. That doesn't outweigh the life giveaway, even in that environment. And I'm in the Aristocrats package. I'm trying to drain May with my Orzhov that I'm doing here. Do I want to give her 7 life back to get rid of her threat? I may be forced to make that choice, making my grind longer, but it's still worth it. It's a greater good type of philosophical conversation.
And you're obviously speaking as if you have to use that in order to answer a 7 mana creature. You might not have to, or a 7 toughness creature, right? Or a power creature.
Right.
You might be looking at like, well, I just want to answer this 3 power creature or 4 power creature, and then the life gain from Plow isn't quite as impactful to my ability to be able to win the game, right? Even though the actual efficiency of the removal is just absurd. So, yeah, but like you say, there's always going to be a trade-off in a removal spell like that, right? So similar with something like Path to Exile, which actually isn't listed, but Path is just as efficient. It's 1 white mana, exile the creature, but now they get to go and get a basic land and put that land into play tapped. So different removal, different kind of environment. You might, argue that if the life totals, if preserving your own life, or if just attacking your opponent's own life is so critical to the way that the cube functions, you may say, you know what, Plow, even if, it's a very powerful cube, maybe that's just, I don't want to do that. Or maybe you say that, hey, the mana resources are so critical in this cube that I would actually be happy to put in Swords to Plowshares, but maybe Path to Exile is a little bit too much.
Now I take this card out, May, and I put it on a silver platter, and I take it out of context, and I present it to you. Is this a good Magic card?
Oh, absolutely. It's 1 mana to remove something.
Right, exactly. So that's the context of the play. Do you see how it just transitioned where the environmental context separated itself from the generically good concept of the card based on us as Magic players?
And again, please check the show notes for all the cards. Ignore the art that Anthony used here for Swords to Plowshares.
I like that art.
I like that art, but it's not the OG art, which is just sensational.
So I want to do a cross comparison of 2 cards here. One of them's going to be Faithful Absence, which also shows up in my horror cube, but also a lot of powered vintage cubes. And for 1 colorless, you get a Plains instant. destroy target creature or planeswalker, which is very important. It creates that versatility that May alluded to early on the episode as a qualifier. But its controller investigates, which creates a clue token. They pay 2, they sack it. They can do that at instant speed, and they can draw a card. It is a slow replacement for what you've done here. That's interesting.
I think it's an amazing card.
It's an amazing card. But now, and I want to cross comparison to where we've now went now. Get Lost, which I say to Stu.
This is my house. You get lost.
Yes, fairly regularly. It's hard to find his house anyways. He's out in the middle of the suburbs. But Get Lost for 1 colorless and white to get an instant. Destroy target creature, enchantment, or planeswalker. We just added another piece. But here is... Wait, there's more. Its controller creates 2 map tokens, and they are artifacts with pay 1, so less than the clue. Sacrifice this artifact. Target creature you control explores, which is, I guess they look at the top card of the library. If it's a land, it does a thing. If
Exactly.
Not, yeah, it could buff their creature and give them land. It's neat. But target creature you control explores is powerful, but its sorcery speed is the only time they can activate those maps. You look at these two. Do I want to give card advantage to May?
Well, also, how relevant are those extras? Like, for example, May, the Fey Cube. Tell us all about the planeswalkers that are in your Fey Cube.
0.
None. No. How critical is enchantment removal in the Fey Cube?
I'd say it's relatively critical.
It's
There's
pretty
a lot of
important, right?
game-winning enchantments that can put you in game-winning positions.
Yeah, absolutely. Pretty important, right? So now you've got 2/3 of the permanent type that you can remove with this card. The Planeswalker, as we've talked about in previous episodes, seeing that maybe would send a bit of a bad message. Would you argue? I know we've talked about that in the past, that maybe putting a card like this so someone sees it and they draft it and they're like, oh, Planeswalker. We've talked about it in the past. I really don't think that really should be a thing anymore. It's way too easy to give information, right? You can even state right at the start of the draft, like, hey, you might see cards with Planeswalker on it, or here's the list. There's no Planeswalkers in the cube. Typically, I like to know that early on because Planeswalkers are something that I like to prioritize. Hey, there's no Planeswalkers? Okay, cool. But this card is super awesome, even if it doesn't hit a permanent type that's in your cube, in my opinion.
But taking the context of those 2 cards, which I believe in my mind Get Lost is better than Fateful Absence for a lot of reasons.
Absolutely.
Or you can run them even as a dual package. They run together just nicely. But taking that context and then removing it and putting it something that's looking for not the remove and the planeswalker and all the things it does, but the quantity of artifacts, for example. So put this in Uberbear's Artifact Cube, which we're going to kind of play a little bit of thought exercise here, where the Fateful Absence gave you a clue. This gives you 2 tokens, 2 map tokens, right?
2 artifacts.
Right, which plays into some of the strategies within that environment where you get creatures that get larger because the quantity of artifacts that you control.
That's right.
So you can see where there's choices to be made as the curator evaluating these 2 ideas. And as, you know, in the case of May's Cube, Get Lost has a bit of flavor text. But let's move over to another one here. Oblation, also Oblination.
Oblination.
Yep.
Welcome to the Oblination.
Welcome to the Oblination.
Welcome to the Divination Oblination.
For 2 colorless and 1 white, you get an instant.
Goblin Nation
The owner of target non-land permanent shuffles it into their library, then draws 2 cards. This is inside of Christian's Bant's Enchantment Cube. This falls into his design goals of, I want to deal with the problem. I want to sweep the feet. I don't want the giant juggernauts, 15 stacked high enchantment killing you. But I also don't want Stu to feel bad that I did that. How can I give him something back for what I just did? It's like a little bit of forgiveness built into this idea, because now you're shuffling it back in, and then they get to draw 2 cards. So they get a kind of a proxy replacement of that idea. But you've dealt with the 15/15 with Rancor on it that has trampled nonsense, right? So
you're taking this and just casting it on your own permanent. Like, I mean, why would you not?
You could certainly actually have do this type.
I'm going to
thing.
try to remove your thing. No, just kidding. I'm going to shuffle it and draw 2.
Absolutely.
I run using that idea. I actually put Chaos Warp and Uberbear's 2-headed giant cube for the options of both, right? Because there's that built-in modality it's secret modality, right? Where people look at it. when you're a new player and you go, I've got to deal with this threat that may just dropped in my Golos is on the field and I got to get rid of this. And I sure as heck don't want to have her spin that wheel. So I'm going to Chaos Warp it. Or I can use it in the polymorph package, not as a removal so much as I'm spinning my own wheel trying to get my real threat on the battlefield. So it's an interesting way of looking at removal sometimes and the diversity within. Let's move over to blue. And we kind of talked about the counter magic aspect, and we sure as heck talked about the Curse of Swine. And again, I put Curse of Swine on a platter. May, Stu, is this a great magic card?
Yes, it's
Curse
the best
Swine?
magic card ever printed.
Exactly. Okay, what if I asked
I
you...
feel cursed reading it.
What if I took cards like Pongify and Rapid Hybridization? They're hyper
Hang on,
efficient.
whoa, wait. Roll that back. Did you just say Pongify?
Pongify. All
Pongify?
right, what if I took cards like Pongify?
I appreciate you.
What if I took cards like Pongify and Rapid Hybridization? They're hyper efficient. They qualify on the efficiency scale. 1 blue, instant, destroy target creature. Both of them do that. It can't be regenerated. That's kind of flavor text in these days, but it used to be a real thing. Its controller creates a 3/3 green ape with Pongify. And then Rapid Hybridization, they make a 3/3 green frog lizard, which is a really hard to find token sometimes.
I think I have a couple of those.
But it represents a 3/3 threat that now lands on the field that doesn't give you the necessary trade-off, like even with like Beast Within, where you're getting real permanent. We talked about during the Horror Cube episode where May's like, I think you can do a fight spell. You can see the complexities of it's efficient. I'm going to downgrade you. I'm going to take you off your 5/5 with haste, flying dragon nonsense. But I'm going to give you an ape. I'm going to give you a lizard. What do you think about these type cards?
Unless it's commander, they suck. So here's the problem, right? You look at these cards in a vacuum, as we've mentioned several times already, that you look at it, you're giving your opponent something. Okay, great. There is also the greater problem and the greater vacuum that when you look at these cards, they are blue cards. You are already struggling with creatures. Giving your opponent a 3/3 is a very real obstacle. That is a very real threat, and it doesn't actually get you out of your position of dealing with a creature. It just gives them something else to beat your face in. So you have to ask yourself, what environment wants this, and is my environment the home for it?
I think that's a fair question.
I think it's absolutely fair. I used to run at least one of these cards in like a higher power commander deck, as an example, a number of years ago. I don't run them anymore. I don't think... I think power level wise, they're kind of a little lower down there. And I agree. I think blue... I hate to say it, but does blue really need an effect like that?
That's where blue wants that tempo control, counter magic.
Blue's got
bounce.
better things to do. Like destroying a target creature is fine and everything, and it's only 1 mana. Like it is efficient, obviously. But I think as a blue player, I normally want to do something else. I'd rather be countering things. I'd rather be bouncing things even. So I think they're fine, but I'm not enamored with that as a type.
I think it's an interesting dynamic that the efficiency transition to the cost, though.
Sure.
You see how it kind of varied there? Mm-hmm. May, do you have a thought?
Yeah, I'm actually going to hit you with a curveball back, because when you look at these cards, and let's say that they're in the same pack as an unsummon, what are you both of you picking in that pack?
I kind of want to get rid of the Pongify, because I want to... The token to me represents a card that I can use some other unsummon effect.
Do I have
to
take one of these cards?
You are. Like She's forcing it. She's forcing it. These are pack one, pick ones, and you'll have
one.
3.
Let's say that this is the last 2 in the pack.
I would take these over in summon for me, because a lot of modern creatures come with ETBs in the advent of we've moved to the Mole Drifter world versus the Baneslayer world. This is perfect for killing the Baneslayer. This is bad for killing the Mole Drifter. When I say that, my categorization is when the creature enters the battlefield, it does something substantial, and the player gets a payoff that compensates for the loss of the creature, whereas the Baneslayer enters the battlefield, represents a massive threat in the real card Baneslayer, but it has to wait to your next turn to implement that threat.
All right, so I'm picking on summon, and the reason is very simple. ETBs... pretty strong nowadays. I like the idea that I can unsummon my own creature and get the ETB again. So I'm taking unsummon.
That was a trick. He looked it up on Google, and I was just going with like bounce effects, not thinking. I wasn't thinking about like the reciprocation of that idea. So I can
Turn
see
target
that.
creature to its owner's hand for 1 blue. I'll do that to my creature that you're trying to remove, and then I'll just get get the effect again.
I mean, if we're doing
Thanks for
this,
coming.
then I'm going to counterpoint and say that I'm going to kill my Savannah Lions and turn it into a 3/3 lizard. I mean, if we're playing this kind of magic,
I have a point to make with these two questions, okay? The next question is that when you are playing this card against, you already know an environment with mole drifters, etc., and you don't want to use the unsummon or the pongify in order to just get rid of whatever their mole drifter is, because they already got the value out of it.
Right.
Why would you play the pongify to give them an additional card in that environment? These are the types of questions that you should be asking, you, the audience, not you, Anthony,
and apparently me
but
too.
You, the audience, should be asking yourself, as curator, of what is the context of this environment, and when you're including these, what are you trying to do? Because as Stu mentioned, I chose Unsummon very explicitly for this purpose, because Unsummon can be used on your own creatures. It has innate flexibility that a lot of other things doesn't. If you are in an environment where Savannah Lions is just something that, oh, I'm going to get rid of your Savannah Lions, no, it's now a 3/3, that could be a line of play in your environment that is really good. Or if it's just an environment of mole drifters, then playing the unsummon might be better. Just because I'm going to try to remove your thing, no, I'm going to bounce it. And when you are looking at your removal packages, you, the audience, you need to ask yourself, what interactions are you encouraging with those? And what type of advantages and disadvantages are you giving your opponent by playing it?
Yeah,
I agree.
I agree.
Let's talk about Reality Shift. This is
this card.
This is a card too that has a massive payoff, but it has a drawback, and here it is. Reality Shift. For 1 colorless and 1 blue, you get an instant. Exile target creature, deals with
anything.
Vast amount of threats.
Merit Lage tokens.
Right. Its controller manifests the top card of their library, which that they flip it over. It's a 2/2. It's secret information. They can look at it and they can pay the mana cost and roll it over. So this is a very like commander qualified type of removal spell, but I do see a place for this in a lot of cubes. If I'm not mistaken, and don't hold me to this.
You might be.
I believe this is in my 2-headed giant cube because it's got an interesting dynamic about itself. And I could even see a place for this in the Bant's enchantment cube, following that same line, probably in there. Have to look at his list. But it plays into that. I'm going to take away the thing that I feel is very threatening, but I'm going to not give you the complete. I'm not going to set you back to the Stone Age.
I mean,
I'm
if
going to
you've
give you a 2/2 that you can now enchant, and maybe
you can enchant exactly. Like it's treated as a creature, but I like this card. I want this card with effects where both players play with their libraries revealed, with the top card of the libraries revealed. That's never happened before, but one day it might happen for me. And then I'll reality shift and you'll get a land.
Let's go in total. Let's take that card, reality shift. Let's move over to resculpt. For 1 colorless and 1 blue, you get an instant. Exile target artifact or creature now has diversity, but its controller creates a 4/4 blue and red elemental creature token. We've now taken that card and removed a threat from the game, but now we've given just a huge emergent threat of a 4/4.
Yeah, 4/4's no joke.
It's not a joke. It's not cute like the little monkey running around or the frog lizard, right? The 4/4 evades the bolts of the world, as May talked about, and all those types. It really gets out of the range of a lot of removal. They're turned off. So when you look at a card like that, I don't see that on the same as the manifest token.
It does hit artifacts as well, though.
It gives you diversity. This is where these cards can trap you because they give you versatility. They give you oftentimes efficiency, but then the cost outweighs the usage of the card.
Yeah,
but it's environmentally contextual as well.
I'm happy to use it to get rid of a Cauldron Complete.
Yes, there are
happy to get rid
circumstances.
of,
I mean, a
Portal to Phyrexia or a
Blightsteel
Colossus.
Colossus. Yeah.
Exactly, yeah.
Emrakul, whatever. Maybe it
Emrakul's
doesn't
not an
qualify,
artifact, but you know.
You get the idea. But it's interesting how these cards have reach, and you have to decide, do they fit your design goals, right? Let's talk about Mystic Confluence.
Well, hang on. Again, where do you sort of see this with something like Unsummon, right? Resculpt is 2 mana, you exile something, I'm more than happy to exile my 1/1 Goblin token and get me a 4/4 blue and red elemental creature
You're
token.
upgrading. Nice. I like it.
Exactly.
Yep.
I'm putting a new transmission in.
Yep.
May, what do you think about that?
I also have a very specific example where
Okay.
I'm going to call out, oh, God help me for trying to pronounce this, but Irreleverance Cube Avernus. I somehow nailed it first try.
Good job.
The Avernus Cube, you start with 100 life. So, and combat usually does not matter in this environment,
Okay.
right? Where the shtick is you all start with a descent into Avernus onto the field. You all get a bunch of treasure tokens, etc. Something like this, where you can instant speed exile something, is more important than the 4/4 that you're creating. It's nothing. That 4/4 is nothing. Even if it does attack, you have so much life that it does not exist. It is effectively just exile that card.
Yeah.
So this goes from suddenly a kind of mediocre limited removal card that you could sometimes use with upside, or to a fantastic removal that can exile up to 2 things, so there's no graveyard shenanigans, there's no getting it back, it's just gone. And that's huge. And that is definitely the case where context matters for your removal.
So you're looking at efficiency, you're looking at the versatility of the card, and you're looking at the overarching target build up to what the card can actually hit.
Mm-hmm.
These are all part of the scales you're weighing and that dynamic of the ratios when we're doing this 40,000 foot framework that we're trying to build here, when you're choosing these components and asking yourself, like Resculpt, as Stu mentioned, does have a really great side thing where I'm going to take my Savannah Lions and convert it to a 4/4 and create a real threat, but then throw it into May's story. Not so great anymore.
No.
Right? So it changes the dynamic of the card. But again, I put this on a platter and I go, hey, May, hey, Stu, is Resculpt a good magic card outside of any storytelling that you've received so far?
Nope.
See, that's where these cards get weird, right? Yeah. Which we move into the next one. Mystic Confluence for 3 colorless and 2 blue.
Good
Get an
magic card.
instant. Choose 3. You may choose the same mode more than once. Counter target spell unless its controller pays 3, so they could effectively pay 9, which
Mana
is
leak.
wild. Mana leak, mana leak, mana leak.
Yep.
And then return target creature to its owner's hand. Bounce, bounce,
Unsummon.
bounce, unsummon, and draw a card. 1, 2, 3.
Mm-hmm.
Those are amazing. Gives a lot of versatility, but you can see it checked all the dynamics of the removal suite that we're looking for there, right? It hit the counterpoints, their counter magic points.
Yep.
It also hit
the bounce.
bounce, which is pseudo removal, but still removal, depending on, especially with a token type of concept, right?
Exactly.
Wipes the field of those. And that's where it gets weird, right? That curse of swines happened. Now you've bounced 1, 2, 3 pigs. They're gone forever.
This has been a game winner for me when I've drafted blue, as an example, in a vintage cube on more than one occasion. Sometimes that is all you need to clear the board and just finish the game. Sometimes it's a wonderful way to, ETB, bounce something back to your hand so you can get an additional benefit. Sometimes it's just draw cards. Sometimes, like I say, it's clear the way. I love modal spells like this, or I love multi-use kind of spells, right? Where you've got a bunch of different things that you can do. You can do 3 things. You can do all 3 things. You can do 1 of each. You can, even just drawing 3 cards. I know it's 5 mana, instant speed. It's not Ancestral Recall, but it's still, you have that flexibility. And sometimes, like I say, just clearing the board is enough.
I look at this card as a on the plate win con, right? Like, I can
Yes,
see
you
this
can win
as,
the game with this
I can
card.
see this as a 5/5 flying dragon and you have 5 life. This is a closer for me.
Yep.
I run this in a lot of my environments because it's substantial. It does cause swings, but it's not win more. It's a game closer, game finisher versus like counterspell, what also removes. This just gives you I'm getting your stuff out of the way. Now I'm going to attack you for 9.
Absolutely, yeah.
This is closer for me. This is finisher. So let's move over to black.
All right, May, take it on.
Murder Strider. And of course, you give me the adventure card, as you do. 1 black for a zombie knight, 2/3. Has lifelink, but who cares? Because when it dies, it gets shuffled back into the library. It has the adventure side, which is what we're talking about, which is effectively just Hero's Downfall. So you destroy target creature or planeswalker, and then you lose 2 life. So when you are looking at this card, it is repeatable. It is a removal card for 3. It for the most part, in a lot of environments, can be a +1 in card advantage, because not only are you removing the card, but you're also getting a creature later. So, when you are looking at a card like this, sure, it is not more efficient than, say, Doomblade, but it doesn't matter what its efficiency is, because you are ending up ahead in that exchange in terms of card advantage.
Yep.
So, when you are looking at removal cards like this, you have to ask yourself not just what you're answering, what you're supporting, which is what I kind of alluded to earlier, where this is a card that really benefits from those value decks, those mid-rangey or just those control decks, where I want those extra value things out of my cards. So sure, I'm paying more to do the thing, and that is a good compromise for, hey, all the things that are 3 and later we want to be relevant, but I'm also paying the 3 just to answer it. I'm not getting ahead tempo-wise, but I'm getting ahead card advantage-wise. And that's something to keep in mind.
Yeah, I love cards like this. I love the card again.
Love them.
I love that you're getting that removal and you're getting the battlefield presence as well. A 2/3 lifelink for 3 is not incredible, but it's not bad. And it just, like, it's so very flexible. Like, a lifelinker can sometimes be very, very relevant. Obviously, it destroys both creatures and planeswalkers. What's not to love?
I want to talk about this next card. It's from the Lost Caverns of Ixalan, and it is the perfect amalgamation of 2 cards that I'll talk about afterwards. It is Bitter Triumph. For 1 colorless and 1 black, you get an instant. As an additional cost to cast this spell, discard a card or pay 3 life. Destroy target creature or planeswalker.
Mm-hmm.
In the early days of me playing Magic, losing 3 life and discarding a card was
Horror show.
Why
would I ever want to do that?
That is a disaster waiting to happen, right? Right, because in the worlds of Shivan Dragons and Sarah Angels and all that, you wouldn't want to look at this card and be like, trash. I can't afford to take turns off. Shivan Dragon's going to kill me. But now we've got this card that has brought 2 cards that I love, and I run in a powered vintage environment as well as a horror cube environment, and squish them together. And that's Bone Shards from 1 colorless, hyper efficient, sorcery, toned back tempo, slowed down speed, does so much. As an additional cost to cast this spell, sacrifice a creature or discard a card. Destroy target creature or planeswalker. This card is amazing. Efficiency to the max. Slow, efficient, kills multiple threats.
I think I have a story with this.
Sure, go for it.
I took this out of a deck.
Mm-hmm.
It was a mistake. I was playing up against someone who had, I think, which is it Emrakul the Promised Land that has protection from instants?
I do believe so, yes.
I think it has protection from instants. Or it was some creature. If it wasn't Emrakul, it was another creature that had protection from instants. And I'd replaced Bone Shards with another removal spell.
Because you wanted speed.
Because I wanted speed. Because I was favoring that instant speed removal rather than
the consistent.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And this is 1 mana. And the deck that I was playing it in was like, I wanted to use all of my mana. And so I took this out and put in like a 2 or 3 mana, maybe. It could have been a Hero's Downfall that I was like, man, I'm going to put Hero's Downfall in because I know it's 3 mana, but I can play it at instant speed. It was the biggest mistake of my life because then I got absolutely slapped by a creature with the card that I replaced it with in my hand, ended the game. And this is just a better card. Like you get to discard a card, and so many times that's not even a negative, right? So many times that can be a positive, and it's just hyper efficient, right? It's not non-black, it's not power toughness conditional or any of that kind of stuff. It's destroy a target creature or a planeswalker for 1 black. And if I have to sacrifice a creature, is it really that big of a deal? Probably not. I should, or if I can't, sack a creature, then I can discard a card. I'm with you. I absolutely love Bone Shards. I think it's incredible.
Now we get that speed, but we don't quite get the Hero's Downfall speed. We move over to Infernal Grasp, so we're not paying 3, we're paying 2, but for 1 colorless, you get, and 1 black, you get instant destroy target creature, you lose 2 life. So in the vintage environment, the life is a resource. In the Inverness Cube that you were talking about before, life doesn't particularly matter. In a hyper, aggro environment, 2 life matters a lot, so it gets contextualized really fast. But you take Bone Shards and Infernal Grasp, you squish them together, and you get Bitter Triumph. That was what I wanted to show here. Sure. As we've moved forward, all three of these cards have different merits, including Hero's Downfall, right? Which I run all 4 of those in a Powered Vintage environment because they have different speed allocations, different timings, and when you want to do it. And then we've talked about this on numerous episodes. I run a 540 Powered Vintage cube. I need to have diversity because you don't typically draft the whole cube.
I actually think that Hero's Downfall has probably seen its day because I think there's too many cards like this that are just able to answer those threats. I know you're at 540, so
I agree with you.
You've got that consideration.
But
I don't dislike Hero's Downfall. It's a flexible card. It's an instant speed.
As your opponent, has taken this suite of 3, I'm running whatever version of Bitter Triumph, Bone Shards, Infernal Grasp, and all you have left in your draft pool is Hero's Downfall, you're not going to scoff at it.
I'm probably not running black then if you've run all of those.
If you haven't gotten cut on the lane. I get it.
I've probably been cut.
But you're still with Splat. That's my point, is that you always have to have the next best in line up to a certain point, and then you cut it off.
Well, the problem with Hero's Downfall is it's double pipped, right?
That's correct.
Bone Shards is 1 black, Infernal Grasp and Bitter Reunion are 1 colorless, 1 black. Very, very easy to splash. Hero's Downfall at a double pip is much more difficult to splash. Same with Murderous Rider. You're not playing Murderous Rider or Hero's Downfall unless you're pretty heavy on the black. I don't know. That's the way that I sort of draft and play decks. I really dislike going double pip on a color that's not like a real focus, or unless I have a ton of fixing for it.
What are your thoughts, May?
Yeah, the pips on your removal definitely matter because it determines what decks are going to play it. And when you have mono black decks that can only take advantage of those Heroes Downfalls, you have to ask yourself, well, then what do these mixed decks with black in it do? What do they have as options? And is that a trade-off that you're okay with?
Yeah, I would agree. We're going to do an episode about that.
Yeah, I think I'm
going to copyright that episode right now because for a long time, I felt that Wizards of the Coast have overutilized colorless mana in a lot of spells like that. I would much prefer to see spells, especially powerful ones, be much more heavy on the colored pips than the colorless pips.
Yeah, I agree with
right?
that.
And have to force players to commit to a color. I think, you and I have talked about this, right? That you're certainly in the cube, like in the fake cube, you don't want like the 5-color good stuffs deck to be a thing rather than pushing the players towards an archetype, right? And there's ways to, I suppose, if I will,
you could curtail it.
You can curtail it. You can control it by reducing the amount of fixing that's in the cube, as an example. And I think that's just fine, even though as a player, personally, I would prefer to see better fixing and then see the spells just be more difficult to cast because the color pips are more intensive. So, but we'll talk about that at another episode. Tell us, all right, mate, give us the last one. This isn't in your fake cube. Tell us why this is the best removal spell ever printed and why it should literally be in every single deck of all time.
As she nods her head.
As she shakes her head disdainfully at me.
And for the listeners, I also use I use the full textless art for no reason whatsoever. I was lazy.
Wait, what?
The Damnation.
Oh, sorry.
I don't know why I did that, but here we are.
No, Damnation's not in the figure. But it's just 2 black for destroy all creatures that can't be regenerated.
Yeah.
And when you have something, and we talked about this a bit earlier, where it is a mass board wipe, you are looking at potential trades of up to +2, +3 in card advantage, and your opponent's just kind of sitting there twiddling their thumbs at that point because you just got really far ahead for 4 mana. So when you, as a curator, are looking at some of these cheaper, more efficient board wipes, and the joke being here that Crippling Fear was effectively just a damnation in my cube. But when you are looking at it, the problem is that all the players who invested very heavily into their board now are put so far behind that they have a hard time getting back into the game even when the environment is slow. And environments that are running Damnation, they're not slow environments, right? And when we are looking at these board wipes and how efficient they are, we need to ask ourselves, as curators, why should our players invest into their board? if somebody can invest 4 to blow it up.
Yeah, this is a shout out to our good friend JP. He despises, from conversation we had, the 4 mana suite of removal, mass removal to begin with, because it's such a setback, exactly on point with what May just said. As in, the establishment of a board to finish a game just got completely eradicated for 4 with card advantage transition. All these things just happen. There's a time and place. There's a speed of a cube.
I agree. I think it's so very much environmental dependent on how good, like at a vintage cube level, I would probably argue that for the most part I would use Damnation as a sideboard card. It's rare that I use, unless I'm kind of struggling a little bit for playables, that I'm going to put Damnation in the main deck if I've drafted well.
If I'm doing Super Friends, I do spot removal and mass removal.
Yeah, and I mean you've also got if you're drafting Super Friends, you've also got removal that's built into some of the planeswalkers as well. And even if it's not, you don't necessarily have to remove the creature. Sometimes you're either bouncing them or whatever. So yeah.
So, if you would humor me for a second, just so that way I can kind of defend my decision a bit. The reason that I had things like Crippling Fear, and the one that was not as mentioned as much as it should have been, which was Breath of Darigus, which was a 1 in a red kicker for 2, and it deals 4 damage to each creature without flying in each player. Those are effectively 4 mana board wipes. My reasoning behind it is that there are a lot of cards that generate incidental value by entering the battlefield to draw cards. There are a lot of adventure cards that get you extra value. There are lots of things that get you additional value for those cards. The issue that I was trying to counterbalance was, how do I keep the adventure card values in check? So I initially put in those cards as a way to kind of counterbalance those, because Crippling Fear was very explicitly designed against things like adventure, because adventure cards don't have an overlapping kindred theme, right?
Mm-hmm.
And when I look at Breath of Darigus, it's a specific way that fairies, dragons, whatever, later in the game, you can keep your big stupid threats and sweep out all the little ground threats that we can kind of close the game.
Yeah.
However, what I didn't consider was its effect on the cards that I was trying to support. Why would the Elf deck, which was a very non-deck at CubeCon, unfortunately, why would they want to invest into their board when somebody can just pay 4 to sweep it?
Right. And I would say in your cube in particular, right, because the rewards in the Fey cube, there's a lot of reward for getting a lot of creatures onto the battlefield, right? So, for example, the whole party mechanic, right? So, when you're able to make that happen, and you've got each of those creature types on the battlefield, the rewards are just absolutely monstrous. But you've had to invest a lot of resources, right? It's a lot of cards out of your hand potentially, and then someone, like you say, just comes along and pays 4 mana and removes it. You've tried to assemble what is a big signpost, a big theme within the cube to say, right, this is something that you should aim for, is to just expend a lot of resources into putting the party together. And the game is basically at your fingertips if you're able to do that. Are you really sending a good message by saying, well, you can do that, and that's great, but then someone's just going to spend 4 mana and then hit you with idiots and drop your life total to 0. So, yeah, it's not a great sign, is it?
My idea was to create tension, where it's just like, all right, you've now invested into your board, you have full party, you now have your thing that makes it indestructible at instant speed, or so that way people can't answer you at instant speed. Okay, great, cool. But what does that actually do in the face of board wipes? It means that those really fast decks, in the case of the Orzhov party in particular, where I have a full party by turn 4, I needed a board wipe by turn 4.
Yep.
Because I needed to create that tension of, okay, you've now invested a lot into this strategy that can potentially win the game and is hard to answer. So I tried to create that tension with the board wipe. However, in hindsight and with player feedback, I can also acknowledge that it's not quite the tension resolver that I am looking for in my environment. So I can actually look back and readdress the value on that 4-drop of, maybe I can look at some later ones, or in the case of this harsh mercy that we mentioned earlier, of something that actually just leaves them something too, so that way they're not completely just put behind. And when you are listening to this, listener, right, you are thinking to yourself, what is the tension point of my board wipes? How mana efficient do I want it to be? Because how mana efficient is the go wide decks? Or how far behind mana wise am I putting them? How many cards am I putting them behind? For example, in the enchantment cube that we mentioned earlier, a board wipe in that environment is not much different in terms of how many targets that it's hitting than Curse of Swine. But Curse of Swine replaces those targets. So yes, absolutely, Wrath of God hits all of your creatures, but you only have like 3, maybe sometimes, rarely 4 creatures that you've invested into, right? And the way that it kind of was counterbalances was things like Bestow and whatever, but it doesn't matter because it's an environment where you're trying to stack up. So when you are looking at that mana efficiency, you are no longer paying 4 to just board wipe those 3 couple creatures. Oh, the mana value and et cetera isn't that great. Now we have to keep in mind how many enchantments are on those. How invested are they on those creatures?
It's not just 2 creatures.
Now that board wipe becomes backbreaking.
Yeah, it's not just 2 creatures. It's 2 creatures and 3 enchantments. And like I say, it happened to me. I was fortunate that on the one occasion that it did happen to me, I knew that the player sitting across from me had it in their hand. I did not invest heavily into the board, so I was able to kind of get around it. But again, that's sort of a signpost that I think needs to be established early on. Like, May, your cube, the themes and the play styles that you're trying to encourage in your cube are for people to put their permanents on the board quickly and efficiently, right? So it's not, there's plenty of cubes where I've played where, even going all the way up to a vintage cube where you're not necessarily always incentivized to have to dump your hand out as quickly as possible. But in a situation where you're effectively encouraging players to do that, then including board wipes that are very efficient, it just kind of goes against the grain.
So let's talk about red. Red itself, right? Players what I have found with time is that players are willing to sacrifice raw power and efficiency for modality and for more interesting lines of play. Using the example we talked about before, lightning bolt.
I do this all the time. Let me just say, I do that all the time. It never ends well.
Right, but let's go raw power, lightning bolt.
Well, mate, tell us about lightning bolt and why it should literally be in every single cube ever.
No. Do not put it in every cube ever. Please, I'm begging you.
I do want for the record to redact that initial statement. As I have learned her environment, I would say that it does not have a place there. But yeah, ignorance is bliss, so I learned. But let's move over to a different idea. Let's move past the lightning bolts of the world. I recently had a recommendation, and it's going to be kind of on the same plane. It's going to be the incinerates and the searing spears. And I'll use searing spear as kind of the model here. And it's still in the Uberbear's horror cube, my horror cube, as Stu likes to suggest. But Searing Spear, for 1 colorless and 1 red, you get an instant. Searing Spear does 3 damage to target creature or player, essentially any target.
Right.
It's the next best movement, right?
Sure.
But it also falls into... It's not interesting. It's definitely red deck wins, but people like that. But it doesn't really play into the diversity of different decks. So I've had some options presented to me by players that look at my cube and they're like, hey, I've got some ideas, right? Unholy Heat for 1 red, you get an instant. Unholy Heat does 2 damage to target creature and planeswalker. So we've turned off the target scalability and we've turned it down by 1 on the peg of actually, increasing the gameplay, right? Doesn't do 3. But you get Delirium. Unholy Heat deals 6 damage instead if there are 4 or more cards among the cards in your graveyard, or types rather.
Yeah.
So that makes it more interesting, I guess. It creates like a diversity in the gameplay where players are encouraged to do something different.
It sees constructed play for a very good reason, in that when you have the ability to build a 60 card deck where you know that getting those 4 card types is going to be plain sailing, right? So if you've got a bunch of fetch lands, you've got creatures that are probably going to end up in the graveyard, you've got a Mishra's Bauble, you've got a Thoughtseize, you've got other, an instant as an example, it does make it quite easy for that Delirium to hit. So I suppose for a card like this, you kind of want to decide, do you want to just include it as it is usually going to be just a 1 red, hit a creature or planeswalker for 2, or is there a consideration that, hey, maybe occasionally you'll get that Delirium, maybe it's something that you can actually functionally work towards within an archetype that I support within the deck. But I think as just a overall flexible card, and the fact that it is that 1 pip less, right? Or that 1 damage less. 2 damage, and May, you talked about this with your Fey Cube, right? The difference between that 3 damage and that 2 damage within the scope of the entire removal package or the removal spells that you have within your cube is gigantic.
Yep. Toughness matters. There is a huge difference between 2 and 3 toughness within the Fey Cube, where something at 2 toughness, it can't eat a shock, which means that you are trying to either get immediate value out of it, or it's so cheap you don't care about it. But as soon as you get to 3 toughness, now all of a sudden, all the other answers to deal with 3 toughness are around 3 mana, where it jumps that efficiency so far because all those two cost shock type effects are in the 1 and 2 slots, right? Mm-hmm. So the difference in mana efficiency of your creatures versus the removal is so drastic in the Fey Cube between that 2 and 3 toughness. That 1 point difference made such a huge impact between something shocking you for 1 mana or something removing it for 3. That is what I was trying to emphasize with the removal package in my environment, where black has the best removal options. It has the only one that can do -3 to something for 2 mana. Because that is black's shtick, that is part of its color pie, it is firmly placed, that is the one card that does it for that mana cost. That is just something I considered.
We'll go on to the next one, because we'll try and go through these a little quicker. Red has the burn, right? It has the burn and the direct damage. That's kind of that's its thing, right? And it also has a couple of spells, or more than one spell, a few spells, that have this sort of modal ability, multiple ability. We talked about Abrade earlier, and this is another one that I think is phenomenal. And this is Cathartic Pyre. This is 1 colorless and a red for an instant, and you get 1 of either deal 3 damage to target creature or planeswalker, right? Pretty good. Removal only, can't hit face. You also have discard up to 2 cards, then draw that many cards. I love cards, I'm going to state this a gazillion times, cards that give you a choice like that. What I love about something like this is that this can be so impactful at any stage in the game. It's wonderful. The amount of times, again, I'm going to talk about yesterday because I got my butt handed to me, but I would have loved this in the game that I played against our good friend Samich, where I drafted I built a 16 land deck, and I drew 11 lands, and it sure would have been nice to have the ability to be able to play this, dump 2 of those lands, draw 2 cards, hopefully get some action, away we go. Or it's great in the early game when you get to remove a creature. Not quite the efficiency of a Lightning Bolt. And May, again, you didn't want to put Lightning Bolt in there because the 3 toughness was so critical, right?
Yep.
What about doubling the mana requirement? Would that be for something like Cathartic Pyre, right, which gives you that extra option as well? Is just the fact that it deals that 3 damage just an absolute no-go? Or does a card like this that is double, it's only 1 versus 2, but it is a significantly increased mana investment. Would this be a card that you would even remotely consider for the Fey Cube, given you have to pay 1 extra? Over Bolt.
No. Well, the obvious answer is flavor, but outside of the obvious answer being flavor, the problem with this card in particular, in the case of my environment, is that all of my answers at 3 damaging cards, or my, I will say, less conditional removal starts at 3. I have a very strict line when I want my threats to be answered, because when I am trying to curate a lower powered environment, for the most part, that's why you'll notice where I have really cheap but strong creatures, like in the case of Nalia, but there's lots of options to deal with those cheaper options, right?
Yeah.
But all those cheaper options can't deal with the top end stuff,
Yeah.
which is weaker than those early little duders, but it doesn't matter because there's less options to answer them.
And this I think is wonderful for a, we've asked the question, is this a bad card, right? So I'll ask you guys right now, is Cathartic Pyre a bad card?
Absolutely not.
I think it's fantastic.
I think it's a good card as well. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to fantasize about a worse card, right? I'm going to straight up design a card right now, live on the show. I'm not going to give it a name because it doesn't matter, but it's going to be a 3 mana spell, right? Instant.
Dumpster Pyre.
2 red and 1 colorless. Choose 1, discard up to 2 cards, and draw that many cards. And, or it deals 2 damage to target creature or planeswalker. How would a card like that fit in to your cube, given that it's a worse card than what we're looking at right now, but it's within that power band of the removal that you're looking for?
So if you're getting the and or effect in order to draw cards...
No, you're getting or. It's one or the other. Just one or the other.
Oh, one or the other?
Yes,
okay.
That's it. For
1 more mana, I wouldn't run it. The reason why is because at 3 mana, I'm trying to answer it. If it did the same thing verbatim, but it costs like 1 red, as an example, then that would be a perfect slam dunk into the fake cube.
Okay.
No bars held.
So you would still
However,
do it if it hit the 3 damage at 3, but the 2 damage just means it's not good enough anymore?
Yes.
Okay.
So, for example, I have Searing Blood, which its flavor's not fantastic, but at 2 mana, it does 2 damage to a creature. Nobody likes paying 2 mana to do a shock, right? That feels bad. But it also deals 3 damage to that creature's controller, because I really wanted to have that burn aspect in the Fey Cube. I really wanted to be able to attack somebody's life total directly, but I needed to do it in a way where it's not just you're stuck directly hitting somebody to the face where it's not just something like a lava spike to just hit for 3 because then only the burn deck wants it. Or in the case of, say, Lightning Bolt, where it's so egregiously powerful in the environment that it just kind of deals with everything. Okay, cool, great. You have your Nalia, which is your 3/3 creature that makes things indestructible when she attacks if you have a party by that time. Then what are you going to do? What good does your shock do against it? But all of a sudden, Lightning Bolt gets introduced, and guess you don't have a party mechanic anymore. Guess you got a deal.
I was just going to say the same thing. Like, I wouldn't be mad knowing how the Fey Cube works to only have to use 1 card out of my hand to deny you of your party and deal 3 damage to your face. Like, one card to 3 damage to face, right? We've been kind of accepting over the years that that's pretty efficient, right? That's not bad. 3 damage to someone's face is never a bad thing. But then I've also got to remove one of your creatures, and I've only had to expend 1 card out of my hand to do that. I ain't mad about it.
So you can kind of see where cards like this give more versatility than cards like Incinerate and Searing Spear.
Absolutely, yeah.
They're raw power, but players in my group, my meta, are willing to sacrifice that raw power of any target 3 for that more interesting dynamic that these type cards provide.
And I think what May's talked about with where she wants that to be, right? Where you want the removal to be, as far as how much damage you want to do, at what mana investment, right? That you've got a really strict guide for where you want that mana investment to be and how much damage you want it to be able to do to those creatures, right? You've got that benchmark. It's at 3 mana. You don't want players to be able to remove one of those 3 toughness creatures for only 1 or only 2 mana. So I think that's such a great guide point for curators out there to really think a lot about, where the toughness is for those creatures within the cube and the impactful creatures, and how you want players to be able to build the archetypes that you're presenting to them, and just how important those decisions could be. Let's go on to green.
Which is the greatest removal suite.
Listen, let's go back story time. There was a time.
We'll do story time. I'm going to present this one.
Listen,
you're stealing my story.
No, I'm not. I'm going to just say, there's a card that you haven't included here. We talked about it in the pregame, which was Prey Upon. There was a time where I played a 60 card plus 15 sideboard cards, modern mono green, and yes, it did have a Colonian Tusker ×4 and a Leatherback Bailoff ×4, but it also ran, I know, but it also ran 4 Preyapons. I don't know if I ran them in... I don't think it was a main board. I think I ran it in the sideboard. It was tech, actually, against the Splinter Twin combo, right? Amongst others. There was other... I think I had other ways. Vines of Vastwood, that was another tech against that. But, I mean, Preyapon is a 1-mana removal spell. But hella conditional. You've got to have a creature that you can use to obviously fight. But, yes, green is rather screwed over when it comes to this kind of stuff.
So my story time, right? This is my wish. I'm taking it back. I'm taking them all back.
I don't have a fire in here, but I'll imagine.
So I recently had a conversation. Our good friend Nathan that has the almost legendary cube, which is legendary centric and all the things and above. And when we were kind of going through the cube, I was giving some constructive criticism that was asked upon me. And one of the cards that was presented for me as an argument or a polite debate was Berserk for 1 green to get an instant. Cast this spell only before the combat damage step. Target creature gains trample, and it gets +X, +0 until the end of the turn, where X is that creature's power. At the beginning of the next end step, destroy that creature if it attacked this turn. So his theme is based on legendary creatures. It's pretty much contextualized to the idea of everything must say legendary, with the exception of like things like removal and mass wipes and mana rocks and all things, the normal stuff, right? But I challenged this card. I didn't have any context. Like, Nathan loves this card, like dearly loves this card. It's one of his favorite Magic cards of all time. That was unbeknownst to me. So when I pointed this card out, and I said, I think you should remove Berserk. I think it doesn't really fit your theme. It doesn't really, it's very conditional in the base that having a creature. I gave all these arguments.
You're getting away from our theme now and into don't run your pet cards in your theme cubes just because you like them.
But here we are.
That's what it sounds like.
But here we are. This is where we're at, right? So I said you should remove it. And he said something that kind of just took me off my heels, and he said, it's a removal card. And I said, what do you mean it's a removal card? And I kind of put an argument to our group. You know, I want to win. Something about me that most people know, that I was captain of the debate team in high school. So I have to win, right? So I presented my case to the kangaroo court of my friend circle, and I said, hey, is Berserk a removal card? And I've got some feedback. And they're like, yeah, absolutely. On combat condition, that when this card is cast, that it actually forces either a block, it forces a choice. So by that choice of blocking with the blocker or take this massive amount of damage for something like, let's just say Galta for the funsies, right? You're going to die to it if you don't deal with this. It's removal. And I wanted to present that case on air to you two as the team. And
I love that you use Galta. I love that you use Galta, because this is just pay 1, win the game.
Yes.
With Galta.
Is that removal?
It's dang straight. It's
player
removal.
We're going to go with player removal.
It's absolutely removal. It's player removal, for sure. I don't disagree that it's removal. It absolutely is. It's funky removal, if you will. It does remove the creature at the beginning of the next end step, so no doubt about it. And it's got some game to it.
So does combat tricks now fall into the sphere of removal? That's a very generic. Okay, that's what I wanted to ask. That's the curveball.
Why wouldn't it?
I don't know. Like, it's a weird spectrum of that idea, right? Like, the forcing the block and the creature having to block and dies, right? Is that by proxy removal because you made the creature bigger than what it can sustain?
Yeah.
It can be soft removal.
Yeah.
All right, I'm going to ask the audience. I'm putting a shout out to that one on this episode. If this qualifies, I get all the things about this, but does the audience also agree with that? I'm not really...
I have a spicier one for you.
Go ahead.
Because we didn't get to talk about my boy, my baby, Ambush Viper. If we're talking about green, we're talking about Ambush Viper.
Isn't Ambush Viper a bit of a taboo card when it comes down to it, though? I mean...
Rosewater stated that Ambush Viper will probably not get a reprint, and we're probably not going to see cards like Ambush Viper because it kind of goes outside of green's color pie because it's too close functionally to a removal card. However, I want to ask the question of, is that necessarily a bad thing in the case of Ambush Viper? But the follow-up is, would you consider a flash creature in green removal? So
think it
let's
kinda
say
falls into berserk, doesn't
you
it?
have
No.
some
No, I
creature
would
that's
not.
coming in to attack, right? And then I have some 2/3 flash creature, right? And then I eat your 2/2 for 3.
No,
I would say
not.
that's a removal.
I would not.
Then how do you make that argument respectfully and say berserk is removal in the same sentence? That's what I'm trying to challenge here.
The reason I say that is because berserk explicitly states to destroy a creature if it attacked this turn.
Yeah, that's your creature. That's not the opponent's. That's not removing their threat. That's
Unless you
removing your
cast it
threat.
on, if you cast it on their creature, it is.
Yeah, you'd cast it on
Okay,
their creature.
you guys are getting really weird.
No,
I like it.
no, absolutely not.
But I like it.
No.
That's kind of what you did with rapid hybridization.
No, undoubtedly, this card explicitly states destroy a creature if it attacked this turn. Right?
Yeah.
Explicitly. That's why it's a removal spell. I think we are really, really stretching if a flash creature should be put as removal, just because you might have the ability to flash it in and destroy a creature that's attacking. That is just that's just stretching it a little bit too much.
Even
for
with the
me.
word death touch, which
Thank
is
you.
but with death touch,
That's
even
what
with
I'm
death
saying.
touch, even with death
Release the boy ambush viper. I'm begging you.
touch, it's not happening.
I think it's a
I'm
fascinating.
very sorry.
I think it's a
Hang
thought
on,
exercise.
have I got it in the? If I don't have it in the Doom Cube, it's going in the Doom Cube, mate, just for you.
I think it's interesting.
No, it's not. No, yeah, I'll die on this hill.
Yeah, so
I'm a woman of simple needs.
Yes, you
I
are.
want
we're
my
going to
funny
ask
snake.
for audience participation on these two weird arguments, but I think it's interesting that it's a viewpoint on cards. It changes that dynamic of what is removal, what is not. That's fascinating, right? I think so.
I hope other people find it fascinating. We've been
We
talking
do
about it
amongst
for nearly
ourselves.
2 hours, so I hope that there's, that this at least engages some conversation. And I think again, do you in a vacuum really think that a flash creature should be considered removal? No. Does that mean that you can't build that into your cube, where that is maybe part of Green's identity? That, hey, you don't have a lot of removal. You don't really have a good way to be able to remove creatures, right? Green typically doesn't anyway. So maybe instead of other types of removal, I'm going to create that as part of Green's identity, that I'm just going to put a ton of flash creatures in there. And if you do feel that you need to flash a creature in to be able to remove something via combat, then I'm going to give you the ability to do that. I would love to see that work. But again, just in a vacuum, I don't think that's the case. I think that if we're talking, for the purpose of this episode, I think something like a Bushwhack or a Prey Upon or even Ulvenwald Tracker, right? So this is on a stick again, which I love. 1/1 for green. Sorry, 1 colorless, 1 green, tap, target creature you control fights another target creature you control. These are conditional. These are soft removal, right? In my opinion. You need another creature unless your 1/1 is fighting a dang Birds of Paradise, as an example, right? But at least then it does give you some flexibility that you can, if you've got a big size creature out there, then sure, you can go to town on your opponent's creatures. But I think we need to be a little reserved when it comes to what we're calling removal. And let's face it, we've talked about this episode. We really haven't gone into the counter magic, right? We've really focused heavily on the creature removal. I talked about that early on, that, hey, we were going to talk about removal and we're going to, were we going to discuss this within, or were we going to discuss this thinking that removal includes things like counter magic? We've really just kind of focused on the creature removal. And maybe that's just the right way to go about it. Because I think overall, if you say removal to someone, immediately that's what they're going to think of. They're going to think of creature removal rather than counter magic. So maybe we're just kind of setting that precedent, at least for ourselves.
Yeah, I think it's like
Sure.
it's an ongoing philosophical debate in the Magic cube curation world. I get that. That
However,
makes sense. Go ahead.
I do have a statement
Yes.
that I think will settle the is counterspells removal argument.
Okay.
And I'll say counterspells are removal on the stack. You are removing a spell that your opponent has played on the stack. Any other time, it is no longer removal.
Yeah.
It is soft removal.
Yeah. I
Yeah,
agree.
I
with
agree.
that.
I agree with that. But I think now we're getting like real deep into the semantic side of it. And again,
Yep.
I think if we're going to, like, removal is just semantics in itself, right? So what are we going to use removal to refer to? Anytime we talk about either this episode or even your cube, right? So again, what do you talk about when you talk about your cube, right? Where you sit down with 8 players who have never drafted your cube and you say, hey, 10% of this cube is removal, right? Do you expect their interpretation of that to be, okay, 10% of it is creature removal or even permanent removal? Or do you expect them to think, oh, 10% is removal from the battlefield, removal from the stack, removal from, whatever the case may be? So
Yeah, I think that jargon has spread over time, but
I don't think we should. I think we need to be specific. I think Magic is complex enough that I think simplifying it like that probably doesn't do anyone any favors.
Sure. No argument there for me.
Thank you.
We're going to move over to our final thoughts. So removal density.
That was my final thought.
It was. And removal density directly correlates to a cube speed.
Of course.
Yeah, just like the lands do. And I'm going to make that correlation and come at me. But so balancing your removal in that range that I talked about, so it's always 2 to 3 less than your threats. Your cumulative amount of threats is a good place to start as far as a framework is concerned. That's my theory. That's where I typically start. So if my highest density of threats sits around 5 mana value, I like to have 3 mana value. So like the murders would kill the dragons to make that make sense. And you can diversify from there. But that's a good place to kind of splinter off from. And then the ratios and all the percentages and the framework, that gets really complicated because nobody wants to do statistical math class and talk about that.
Well, maybe they don't, but we probably have someone that we know that does.
We do, in fact. Dr. Jason Brinkley, he would love to break
He would
that
love
down.
to.
It would be his pleasure.
Yeah.
But using a pie chart of some sort or standing it over to Sid, the detective solving the murder scene with the photographs, is a good way to look at it from the highest level and see what my ratios to targetability is. And I think it's a good place to start. May, you have a thought?
Absolutely. Yeah, my thought was thank you all for listening this long and helping us with the debate is lava wet? And I think that is a good time for us to wrap up.
Yes, lava is wet.
Lava. No, but you don't sink in lava.
Water is not, but lava is.
That is a misnomer. So, like, even in Terminator 2, where Arnold Schwarzenegger actually just started immediately going underneath the lava, the density would have held him above the lava. There's no way he could do a thumbs up. He would have just sat there.
Isn't he made of, like, metal?
He would have sat there for, like, an hour because he would have slowly... The density...
I'm going to go out on a limb and say that if the movie had ended with Arnold Schwarzenegger sitting on a pit of lava, going, ouch, the soles of my feet are hurting, rather than sticking his thumb up through the lava. I don't know if that would have quite had the same impact. But but philosophically, yes, thank you for the clarification on, the real.
Based on that, let's move over to the socials.
All right, so first of all, big shout out to our new administrator, new head honcho, over at the Magic the Gathering Cube Drafting Facebook group page, which is Anthony Adams.
Yeah, there's like 700 members.
There's a lot of members, and I've been checking it out a little bit more recently. There's a lot of really cool discussion going on there. A lot of people that ask a lot of good questions, not just a place that I think if you're looking for guidance, but also if you're someone that's experienced and looking for help, I think that's a great place to go and be able to interact with the community a little bit. All right, if you love the show, as always, we would really appreciate, give us a 5-star review on your chosen podcast platform. Really helps the channel get out there to more and more Cube enthusiasts. If you would like to support us with a purchase at altersleeves.com, you can use our affiliate link, altersleeves.com/UberCube. Get 5% off your purchase. All kinds of wonderful products there to bling out your cube or whatever magic format that you're into. You can also use our Inked Gaming affiliate link. You can check that out. We've got it on the Twitters. You want to go and get some dice bags, mouse pads, all kinds of, again, bling for your cube. Go check it out. Wonderful products there. We have our own official UberCube podcast playmats that I rock at every session.
Yeah, they're gorgeous.
They are gorgeous. Come check us out on Twitter. We are at UberCubeMTGPod. You can also reach us via email. You got a question about the podcast or something cube related, reach us at UberCubeMTGPodcast@gmail.com. And again, come check us out on Discord. I want to give another shout out to our Deck Boast channel.
It's amazing.
It is.
We would love to see all your CubeCon distributions that you built. That would be amazing.
Let's see the
Get that data.
Let's
I want to
see
see
the
the decks. Yeah, absolutely.
Tell us about the Patreon, Anthony. Give him a shout out.
So let's start out with our good friend Preston, who inspired this episode.
Thank you, Preston. Much love.
We hope that we captured the spirit that you had requested to discuss this at a... Well, we learned a few things that in T2 that Arnold Schwarzenegger shouldn't have actually sunk that quickly. But mostly, I think we covered kind of the aspects of how to evaluate your cubes and balance the removal within your different environments based on context, based on versatility of the cards.
Exactly.
And sometimes players are willing to sacrifice the raw power, the efficiency for just fun.
And for being one of our, maybe our longest Patreon, I think it's great that we've been able to give back. And also because Anthony did almost steal your pen at CubeCon.
I did.
So apologies for Anthony almost stealing your pen, but we're glad to be able to give something back.
Other than that, we're going to say the thing that we always say here at UberCube, and it's Happy Cubing Removal.